Picture the single most feared weapon system in medieval Europe. A knight in full plate armor, mounted on a warhorse bred and trained specifically for war, backed by a lifetime of training that started in childhood and cost more than most villages would see in a generation. This wasn't just a soldier. It was functionally a tank, the most expensive, most terrifying thing you could put on a battlefield in the year 1420. Now picture the group that beat that tank repeatedly for 15 years straight. Farmers, actual farmers, carrying the same tools they used to thresh wheat every autumn, led by a man who was, for a significant part of this story, completely blind. Not once did an army of armored knights manage to defeat them in open battle. 5 separate crusades, personally sanctioned by the Pope, marched into Bohemia to crush them. 5 times they marched back out, defeated. This is the story of the Hussite Wars, the mobile fortress that made peasants nearly unbeatable, and the one-eyed, then fully blind general who never lost a single battle in his life. It starts with an execution. In 1415, a Czech priest and reformer named Jan Hus was burned at the stake for heresy after criticizing corruption inside the Catholic Church. He never commanded a soldier in his life, but his death turned a religious reform movement into a full-blown rebellion. And when the Bohemian king died a few years later, the man positioned to inherit the throne, Sigismund, was the very emperor the Hussites blamed for Hus's death. Sigismund asked the Pope for help. The Pope obliged, declaring an official crusade against the Hussites of Bohemia. What followed wasn't a skirmish. It was the full military machinery of Catholic Europe, aimed at crushing a population of farmers, craftsmen, and minor nobles who had never fought a war in their lives. Leading that population was a man named Jan Žižka. He wasn't a peasant himself. He came from minor gentry, had served as a mercenary for years, and had even worked as chamberlain in the royal court. He'd fought in one of the largest field battles of the medieval period, the Battle of Grunwald, where he lost one of his eyes. By the time the Hussite Wars began, he was already around 60 years old, missing an eye, and about to build one of the most effective military systems in the history of warfare, using nothing but wagons and farm tools. Here's the actual problem Žižka had to solve. His army had almost no professional soldiers, almost no armor, and almost no cavalry. Against them stood exactly what medieval armies were built to field: heavily armored knights, whose entire purpose on a battlefield was to charge, break enemy lines, and ride down anyone who couldn't hold formation. In a straight, open fight, peasants with farm tools don't beat armored cavalry. Nobody in Europe expected them to. So Žižka refused to give them that fight. Instead, he looked at the one piece of equipment every farming village already had in abundance, the humble wooden cart, and turned it into a war machine. He reinforced the sides with thick planks and iron plating, cut firing slots into the wood, and taught his men to chain these wagons together, wheel to wheel, into a tight circle or square. The Germans had a word for it: Wagenburg, wagon fortress. Inside that fortress, each wagon carried a crew of up to 20 soldiers: crossbowmen, early handgunners firing primitive gunpowder weapons called pistols, and, crucially, farmers wielding threshing flails, the same tool they used every harvest to separate grain from stalk, now modified with iron spikes. A flail doesn't require years of training the way a sword does. Everyone in that army already knew how to swing one. Žižka simply weaponized what his people already were. The tactic worked with brutal simplicity. Knights trained their entire lives to charge and break enemy lines, would see a loose ring of wagons and farmers, and assume exactly what anyone would assume: this is not a real defense. They'd charge, and they'd hit a wall, literally. Horses refused to jump reinforced wagons chained together. Riders got funneled into narrow gaps between them, exactly where crossbowmen and handgunners were waiting, firing point blank into men who could no longer maneuver. The smoke and thunder of early gunpowder weapons, terrifying and unfamiliar, spooked war horses that had never encountered anything like it. Once a charge stalled against the wagons, Žižka would spring the second half of his design. The wagons would open, and disciplined infantry would pour out to finish off an enemy that was now dismounted, disorganized, and trapped. The first time this system was tested in full at the Battle of Sudomierz in March of 1420, Žižka had roughly 400 people with him, including women and children fleeing toward safety. Crusader cavalry numbering around 2,000 caught them in the open. Surrender looked like the only option. Instead, Žižka pushed his wagons into a swampy patch of ground, forcing the knights to dismount before they could even reach him, stripping away the one advantage that made a knight worth fearing in the first place. 400 farmers beat 2,000 professional soldiers that day. Months later, defending Prague itself, Žižka fortified a hill called Vítkov with what may have been as few as a few dozen defenders against a besieging force that, counting all its crusader reinforcements, may have numbered close to 100,000. The hill held. A counterattack sent the attackers fleeing in such disorder that many drowned trying to escape across the river below. 400 to 500 of Sigismund's men died that day. The Hussites lost 2 or 3. And here's where the story gets almost unbelievable. During the siege of a castle called Rabi in 1421, Žižka lost his second eye. Completely blind for the remaining 3 years of his life, he did not step back from command. He was carried onto the battlefield in his command wagon, had the terrain and enemy positions described to him in detail by his officers, and continued directing battles with the same precision that had already made him famous. In that condition, totally blind, 60 years old, leading a peasant army against the best trained soldiers in Europe, he did not lose a single engagement, not one. Between 1420 and 1424, 5 separate papally sanctioned crusades entered Bohemia to destroy the Hussites. 5 separate times, they failed. It would be dishonest to end the story there, though, as if the wagon fort made this army invincible forever. It didn't. The Wagenburg's genius depended entirely on discipline. Every crew holding position, every wagon staying chained, nobody breaking formation to chase a retreating enemy into open ground. Žižka enforced that discipline ruthlessly. But Žižka himself died in 1424, not in battle, but of the plague, while besieging a castle during a campaign into Moravia. He never lost a fight. He simply ran out of time. Command passed to other leaders, most notably a priest-turned-general named Prokop the Great, who kept the winning streak alive for years afterward. But the movement itself began fracturing from the inside. Moderate Hussites versus radical ones, each side increasingly willing to fight the other instead of the Crusaders. In 1434, at the Battle of Lipani, that internal split turned fatal. Moderate Hussite forces, who understood the Wagenburg system as well as anyone alive, deliberately staged a fake retreat. The radical Taborites, still fighting under Žižka's old tactics but without Žižka's discipline, broke formation and chased them out of their wagon fortress and into open ground. The one advantage that had made them unbeatable against foreign knights for 15 years vanished the moment they left it behind. They were slaughtered by fellow Hussites who knew exactly how to beat the system because they'd learned it from the inside. Even that ending carries a strange kind of proof. It wasn't the might of the Catholic Church, 5 separate crusades, or the finest armored cavalry Europe could field that finally broke the Hussites. It was other Hussites using Žižka's own playbook against people who no longer had Žižka. And the story didn't end with Bohemia either. When the wars finally wound down, thousands of veterans who had spent years fighting inside of Wagenburg suddenly had nowhere to fight and a very marketable skill set. They became mercenaries, hired across Central and Eastern Europe specifically for their expertise. Hungary and Poland recruited them by the thousand. A Hungarian general named Jan Hunyadi studied Hussite tactics directly and adapted them for his own wars against the Ottoman Empire. By the 1440s, hundreds of Czech-built war wagons, commanded by officers who had literally served under Žižka, were rolling into battle against the Ottomans in the Balkans. The same tactical DNA, one generation removed, still breaking cavalry that assumed it was unstoppable. So go back to that opening image, the most feared weapon system in medieval Europe, the armored knight, charging at what should have been an easy massacre of unarmed farmers. For 15 years, that charge kept failing. Not because the farmers got lucky, because a blind 60-year-old general looked at a farm cart and a threshing flail and saw exactly what everyone else had overlooked: that you don't need better weapons to beat an army that thinks it's unbeatable. You need to make it fight on ground where unbeatable stops meaning anything at all.